Hello, I'm Corinna Herron and welcome to the Monday Night Review. We're on episode 61 and as quite often happens, today's topic came from me having a late night scroll on the weird side of TikTok because I have my makeup and skincare TikTok, which seems to understand who I am. But then I have my Monday Night Review TikTok, which thinks I'm a boy and so will either show me semi-naked women doing TikTok dances, which I don't particularly want to see, or weird facts from history, which I really do want to see. And one account told me of the bizarre story of Zheng Qi, a Chinese climber who in 1945 went to try and summit Everest. After 3 days he disappeared above the clouds and then he was found at base camp hours later with cuts carved into his entire body in every language, and the cuts spelled out "stay below." Now, I had to find out if there was any truth in this unbelievable story, and I could find none. Not a shred of evidence, only a Reddit thread about this, and obviously there's loads of flaws in the story. Everest had already been summited by then. How would you fit over 600 languages on a body? But whilst on the hunt, I found myself falling down an Everest wormhole. There are 3 things I can say for certain. I have no interest in doing, and this will never change, potholing, going into space, or rock climbing. Nothing on God's earth could get me to even go to base camp of Everest. So I never thought I'd be saying this, but today we're going to be talking about Everest and the bodies that you'll find there. Now, I found this so distressing, considering I'm happy to write about serial killers. I found this so distressing that I have a special guest today. I've had to bring my husband Joe to just be moral support. So I'm going to be telling him live the story of all the people you'll find on Everest.
Hello.
So I don't know why I found this one so distressing. I think it's you'll find out. You get to do the live action finding out of the horrible bits.
Okay. I don't think I'm the best audience for this because I think people who go mountaineering are crazy.
They are crazy.
Cool.
But, okay. I mean, I'm quite glad you're not going to be telling me that I'm crazy and that mountaineering is the best and it's our next holiday. So that's the wrong wife. So my sources today, I've used loads. holidaynepaltrek.com, everester.org, Wikipedia, obviously, allthat'sinteresting.com. There's loads. First off, we're going to talk a bit about Everest, why it's such a big deal and holds such a thrall for those who attempt to summit it. I, for one, assume that most people died from falling off. Mm-hmm. But this is not the case. It's Earth's highest mountain. I should state that Joe is a very clever man and therefore he probably knows all this about Everest, but if you're like me and you avoid Everest knowledge, then some of this might be news to you. Everest is Earth's highest mountain above sea level. It's in the Himalayas. It's on the China-Nepal border, which runs across the summit point. It's 8,848.86 metres high, also known as 29,031.7 feet. There are 2 main climbing routes. Oh, just settle in. There are 2 main climbing routes, one approaching the summit from southeast in Nepal, known as the standard route, and one from the other side in North Tibet. So it's not necessarily the route that poses a problem, especially for experienced climbers. There are trickier mountains technically to climb. It's the altitude, extreme weather conditions, and generally just the extremeness of Everest that make it so dangerous. I just assumed it was impossible to climb. Well, not impossible, obviously, but like really difficult to climb. But it's not. Other places are harder to climb.
I think I knew that.
Oh.
Right.
Right.
But you also get loads of enthusiastic people who don't do loads of other climbing.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem is you do have people who have a lot of money who so can afford to climb but aren't necessarily great at it, as we'll find out.
The only person I know who's climbed Everest is called Massimo, and he has loads of money and
No
loads
climbing.
of muscles,
Oh,
but no climbing experience.
he probably got carried up there.
Yeah.
He probably paid someone to carry him up there. So, the first recorded efforts to reach Everest summit was made by British mountaineers who made several attempts on the North Ridge route from the Tibetan side, as Nepal did not allow foreigners to enter the country at the time. I should also mention that I could have gone really technical on the mountaineering chat, but my brain wouldn't allow it. So, when I went down a rabbit hole onto what a coal was, and then I realised I didn't care.
You've lost me.
Yeah. So we're not going that deep in. So, after the first reconnaissance expedition by the British in 1921, they reached about 7,000 metres, and then the 1922 expedition pushed the North Ridge route up to 8,320 metres, marking the first time a human had climbed above 8,000 metres. It was the expedition in 1924 that resulted in one of the greatest mysteries on Everest. George Mallory and Andrew Irvine made a final summit attempt on the 8th of June 1924, but never returned, sparking debate as to whether they had in fact reached the top and then died on the way down. There's literally was no trace of either of them, for 75 years, until in 1999 the body of Mallory was found after there was a really unusually warm spring and somebody found Mallory.
Nice. Defrosting.
I don't think he was defrosting much, but...
Pickled.
Oh, anyway, his upper torso, half of his legs and his left arm are almost perfectly preserved. He was dressed in a tweed suit and surrounded by early climbing equipment. Why is a tweed suit funny?
It's just such a funny thing to go mountaineering in.
It's such a British thing, isn't it? The Brits going up the mountain in tweed.
I bet the thick tweed.
Yes, well, you need it. He's surrounded by early climbing equipment and heavy oxygen bottles. They found a rope injury around his waist, which led them to believe that he'd been roped to another climber who had then fallen off the cliff and pulled him with them, which obviously happens in climbing. I should say I am going to put pictures up on social media. I have been wrestling with myself since the early hours about whether to do it, because it's quite weird having a picture of a dead body on social media. But it's also quite interesting to see,
I think we want to see the Mallory tweed.
Well, the Mallory tweed, there's not a lot left. Oh. There's quite a lot of his back exposed. Yeah. But also the 1920s oxygen tank and his snow goggles and things. So, I should also apologise for there is quite a lot of names that I'm going to butcher. I'm going to try my best.
Are those guides?
Yeah, mostly.
Enthusiastic Germans.
Yeah.
Spaniards.
You're going to be not helpful at all for this. Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary made the first documented ascent of Everest in 1953 using the southeast ridge route. Norgay had reached 8,595 metres the previous year as a member of the 1952 Swiss expedition. And then the Chinese mountaineering team of Wang Fuzhou, Gong Pao and Qiu Yinhua made the first reported ascent of the peak from the North Ridge on the 25th of May 1960. So those ones we know they've done it. So Tenzing Norgay is a Sherpa, and before we get into the grisly stories, I just want to give the Sherpas a mention. Sherpas are native to the most mountainous regions of Nepal, Tingri County in the Tibet Autonomous Region and the Himalayas. The term Sherpa derives from the Sherpa language, meaning east people, so it refers to the geographical region of where they're from. When we talk about in mountaineering, Sherpas get mentioned a lot, as many of them are elite mountaineers and expert guides at the extreme altitudes of the peaks and passes of the Himalayas. And they're particularly good on expeditions to climb Mount Everest. Today, the term is often used by foreigners to refer to almost any guide or climbing supporter hired for a mountaineering expedition in the Himalayas, regardless of their ethnicity. But Sherpas are renowned for their hardiness, expertise, and experience at very high altitudes, and it's been speculated that part of this climbing ability is the result of a genetic adaptation to living at high altitude, which would make sense. Some of these adaptations include unique hemoglobin binding capacity and doubled nitric oxide production, which is pretty good if you're going to be a climber, but I guess that if you're born at a high altitude, your body will adapt. Interestingly, most Sherpa deaths on Mount Everest are at base camps as a result of avalanches. 16 guides lost their lives in an avalanche of 2014, which was a huge big deal, and they had a strike about working, and it was because a lot of them weren't insured. They rarely die in the death zone, and it's guaranteed that the majority of early summits would not have been successful without the superior knowledge and skill of the Sherpa guides. They also work through incredibly dangerous conditions, dealing with people who've paid a lot of money to summit Everest, and often who get so overcome with summit fever, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that they just ignore their guide when they shouldn't. When Mark Jenkins, a journalist, author and adventurer in Wyoming, was on Everest in 2012, 5 people died in a single day. The Sherpas he interviewed told him that most of the fatalities belonged to clients who had refused to turn around. Jenkins says, "Your Sherpa will tell you, you're too slow, you have to turn around or you'll die." And some people don't. Billy Beerling, a Kathmandu-based journalist and climber, agrees and says without Sherpas, 98% of people who climb Everest couldn't. And I don't know why, I've always found it great when they're like, this guy summited Everest, and it's like, well, and his guide did.
I felt that way about Hillary, because
Yeah.
Sherpa Tenzing.
Yeah, Sherpa Tenzing
Yeah.
got him up there, basically.
Yeah. I wonder if Hillary was probably wearing tweed as well, wasn't he?
Probably. He probably made Tenzing wear tweed. Summit fever is also going to get a quick mention. You can probably work out from the name, but it's not quite as simple as the fervour created by Boxing Day sales. Summit fever is a very real thing, not only caused by the obvious, but exacerbated by the decreased oxygen in the brain, which not only affects a person's decision-making, but also their ethics. We're going to get into that later.
Okay.
Psychologist Christopher Keyes believes that reaching Everest summit becomes so much a part of the climber's social identity, and therefore they want to reach their goal so badly that they make really poor decisions in the pursuit of completing it. Since the mid-2000s, thefts of vital supplies, including food and oxygen, have become really common.
Right.
It's basically impossible to safeguard against theft, especially once you get near the summit, because you make your camp, you go to try attempt the summit, and then you come back, and quite often people will just have nabbed your oxygen.
Whoa.
Yeah, the world is going to hell in a handcart.
You selfish bastards.
There are limited windows of weather when you can climb, which leads to a queue at the summit, which you may have seen in pictures. And oxygen tanks, which can cost hundreds of dollars, get stolen, which can mean the difference between life and death. So now there's a queue to get to the summit.
Mm-hmm. A queue of plums.
I'll put a picture up. And then you have to wait. So you've summited, and then you have to wait to get back down.
Oh, special moment.
And you can be running out of oxygen, and you get back to your camp, and you find the summons.
Nicked it.
Yeah. It's believed that theft of gear and food contributed to the death of Vitor Negrete, the first Brazilian to climb Everest without oxygen in May 2006. He died during his descent at a similar time to David Sharp, who we'll get to in a minute. In 2015, the president of Nepal Mountaineering Association warned that pollution, especially human waste, had reached critical levels. As much as 12,000 kilos, that's 26,500 pounds, of human excrement each season is left behind on the mountain.
12 tons of shit.
Is that how much
Jesus.
it is?
That's a lot.
It's strewn across the verges of the route to the summit, making the 4 sleeping areas on the route up Everest's south side, minefields of human excrement. I just can't imagine going through all of that and being like, I slept in shit, and you can't have a bath. Climbers above base camp have most commonly either buried their excrement in holes they've dug by hand in the snow, or slung it into crevasses, or simply defecated wherever convenient, often within metres of their tents. The only place where climbers can defecate without worrying about contaminating the mountain is base camp. The problem of human waste is compounded by the presence of more anodyne waste. Spent oxygen tanks, abandoned tents, empty cans and bottles, basically anything you can jettison, because the higher you go, the heavier your stuff feels.
Mm-hmm.
So I get why, with the altitude and everything, you want to get rid of anything unnecessary.
Yeah.
But sensibly, the Nepali government now requires each climber to pack out 8 kilos of waste when descending the mountain. So you have to pick up 8 kilos of waste on your way down.
Does that include
That doesn't.
picking up shit?
No, that doesn't.
They should definitely introduce that. I'd pick up about half a kilo of shit every time I scoop the poop.
Yeah, but that's your dogs.
Oh, if you're going to go and climb Everest like some super privileged billionaire,
You have to
then
pick
you
up
can
shit. Well,
pick
you
up some shit on the way
you
down.
have to speak into the microphone. You know that they'd make the Sherpas do it.
Oh, Christ. Okay, so if you said climbers have got to scoop the poop, then the climbers would say, you Sherpa, you pick twice as much shit.
Yeah.
You're right,
I paid thousands.
Yeah.
In April 2019, I can't say this, Khumbu Pasanglamu Rural Municipality launched a campaign to collect nearly 10,000 kilos of garbage from Everest. People ruin everything, I've said. I'd suggest there's room for a clever adventurer entrepreneur to come up with a human waste solution. I think if you had a biodegradable bag that's on like a circle, like a wooden circle, so you can shit in the bag, and then it's biodegradable, so you just sling it down the mountain.
Okay.
That's my solution. Because obviously everything freezes.
So, poo frisbee.
Yeah, but you do it off the climbing route, not where someone's going to be walking. And it doesn't, obviously, that still means there's human shit everywhere, because it's not going to degrade.
Oh. Of course, it wouldn't degrade.
No. So you'd still have shit everywhere, but you wouldn't be like lying next to it.
It needs work. There's shit frisbee.
So it takes around 64 days to climb Mount Everest. The core climbing lasts for about 44 days, and the rest of the time is spent either trekking or acclimatising en route. Trekking on the route is crucial as it helps climbers adjust to the environment. Ugh. By 1980, only about 200 people had summited. Now it's more like 5,000. Over 300 people have died on Everest, and most of them are still there.
Okay.
Disturbingly, because of the extreme cold temperatures, the bodies remain intact, basically exactly as they fell. A stark and very real warning for those who trek past them on their own mission to tackle the world's tallest mountain. When someone dies on Everest, especially in the death zone, it's almost impossible to retrieve the body. In fact, 2 people died trying to retrieve the body of Hannelore Schmatz, who we'll talk about in a minute. The weather conditions, the terrain, and the lack of oxygen makes it difficult, and even if they can be found, quite often they're usually stuck to the ground, so frozen in place, so you would have to rip them apart to take them down.
I can't stop thinking about how humiliating it would be to be the first frozen body on the route. It'd be like, this guy just basically, he'd had his last hobnob about 20 minutes previously, got into the death zone and died immediately.
Oh, it's so awful. It's also incredibly expensive, so to send someone up to rescue a loved one costs between $70,000 and $200,000 US.
Okay.
For some climbers who have the right insurance, search parties will be sent up. The insurance will send a search party for you to try and retrieve the bodies, but for others, they just remain where they lie unless someone is able to move them to a more suitable resting place. We're nearly into the ghastly bit. We're not even in the ghastly bit yet.
Yeah.
despite the tons of
I think with
shit.
with the ship frisbee as well, it'd just be like a thing that turns your body into a giant firelighter.
Why?
That'd be useful. I don't want to be up there preserved in the ice for years. Turn me into a torch and
Okay, so burn you.
me.
I don't know what happens with the burning at that altitude.
Yeah.
I'm no scientist, but it can't be easy. Otherwise, people would be building fires and keeping warm, wouldn't they?
Yeah, you're right. I know nothing.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the death zone and Rainbow Valley. So when I first started down my Everest rabbit hole, I was open-mouthed at why on earth anyone would want to climb a mountain to begin with. I just don't get it.
No, I'm with you there.
It holds no appeal for me. And then I saw mention of Rainbow Valley and I thought, how lovely. Maybe it's so beautiful with magical rainbows that it's worth the horror of the conditions. I was wrong. The death zone is the area of Mount Everest above 8,000 metres, and it's called the death zone because, as the name suggests, it's the area where you're most likely to die. Depletion of oxygen causes a number of problems, both physical and mental, and there's no way of knowing how you're going to react until you're up there. Also, you can have gone up there 80 times, and on the 90th you could have a sudden high altitude pulmonary embolism and just keel over. So there's just no telling how your body's going to react at any moment. The atmospheric pressure at the top of Everest is about a third of sea level pressure, resulting in the availability of only about a third as much oxygen to breathe. Mm-hmm. Temperatures can dip to very low levels, resulting in frostbite, any body part exposed to the air. And since the temperatures are so low, snow is well frozen in certain areas, and death or injury by slipping and falling can happen. Mm-hmm. High winds at these altitudes on Everest are also a potential threat to climbers, and these debilitating effects of the death zone mean it takes most climbers up to 12 hours to walk the distance of 1.72 kilometres. That's 1.07 miles.
That is not far.
Takes 12 hours. From South Col, I told you about this. Now, basically, South Col, if you look at Everest and you've got the summit, it goes down and then there's a sort of dip and then it goes back up to the second summit. Mm-hmm. The Col is the dip.
Okay.
So it's usually the pace of the final camp. So you make your camp there and then you try and summit. That's where all your stuff gets nicked.
Okay, with all the other bastards.
With all the other bastards. Achieving even this level of performance requires prolonged altitude acclimatization, which can take 40 to 60 days for a typical expedition. A sea level dweller exposed to the atmospheric conditions at the altitude above 8,500 metres without acclimatization would likely lose consciousness within 2 to 3 minutes. Rainbow Valley, remember my lovely valley of mythical rainbows?
That's where the unicorns are.
Yeah. Is part of the peak that lies in the death zone, and it gets its name from the numbers of bodies visible, their brightly coloured jackets, making them unmissable against the snow.
Nice.
I had this lovely image of me going to the Rainbow Valley and thinking how beautiful it was, and it was worth all the effort.
It's a load of people in their Mustos.
Yeah, it's just dead people.
North Face gear.
Yeah, it's a North Face ad up there. Interestingly, most deaths occur on the descent, not the ascent. You'd think that going up was the hard part, but it's not. By the time you're descending, you've been exposed to extreme low temperatures and high altitudes for a dangerous amount of time, and there's also the problem of the Mount Everest traffic jam. Because the window is small when you can make the climb, and it takes on average 64 days, there is a genuine traffic jam of people attempting to get to the top. I will put that photo up. Anyone who's ever been in a queue for something they really, really, really want with a ton of other people will know that bad decisions get made and people do not behave well. There have been experienced climbers, including Rob Hall, whom I'm going to mention later, who have died on the descent having waited too long in the queue of people trying to get to the top.
God's sake.
So, we're now going to talk about some of the, dare I say it, famous bodies that are on Everest, and this isn't Lady Gaga. This is people who are kind of the most noticed. It starts in 1979, where Hannelore Schmerz, who I talked about before, became the first German citizen and first woman to perish on the mountain. She summited the mountain, but ignored her Sherpa and made camp in the death zone. She managed to survive the snowstorm hitting overnight and made it almost all the rest of the way down the camp before lack of oxygen and frostbite resulted in her giving in to exhaustion. She was only 330 feet from base camp. Her body remains on the mountain extremely well preserved due to the consistently below zero temperatures, and until recently she was in plain view of the mountain's southern route, leaning against a long deteriorated backpack with her eyes open and her hair blowing in the wind, until extreme high winds of 70 to 80 miles an hour either blew a covering of snow over her or pushed her off the mountain, and they don't know where she is anymore, but she was very visible for a long time.
So she was actually my nightmare of like dying.
I don't think she was
a short walk from base camp.
Yeah, but if you think it takes, I don't know how many feet are in a kilometre.
Yeah, but base camp.
But what I mean is, if you think it takes 12 hours to do a kilometre, then how long is it going to take to do 300 feet? Because I imagine it, you're skipping down, you've summited, it's downhill, you're rolling into base camp. But she ignored her Sherpa. She ignored her Sherpa. Don't ignore the Sherpa. 1996 is a really bad year for climbers on Everest because in May, a blizzard hits that spells the end for many really competent climbers, some of whom I'm going to mention, and in fact, the blizzard and one of the climbers I'm going to mention inspired the book Into Thin Air, which is a really famous book that I will never be able to read.
Yeah.
I read that one climbing book that was terrifying and I had to wake you up when I finished it because it was so scary.
Yeah, I've also read Touching the Void, which is
where they both survived,
boring.
and I still don't want it. Horrible. After I've finished this episode, I don't want to hear about Everest. It's just so disturbing. Anyway, so I have to say, of all the episodes I've covered, I'm really excited to leave this one behind. I'm really excited. That's why you're here. Moral support.
Is it because it's like real? It's like, murders are real, obviously, but there's nothing mystical about it. They're all just...
I have this real thing about how when you die, something happens to your body that you're not in control of and you're not aware of. Your body has this existence without you. And I find that weird. And I think I find it weird that your body can have this, like we'll hear some of these stories.
The German lady with her flaxen hair blowing in the wind.
Yeah. There's no privacy, there's no dignity, there's no...
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's just grim, and people just trekking past, trying to get to the top of the mountain like it's so important. I find it very disturbing.
Oh, God.
But let's get into it, Joseph.
All right.
Scott Fisher is not only a lifelong experienced climber, but he founded an adventure travel company called Mountain Madness, and with his friend Robert Heiss formed part of the expedition that removed 500 pounds of rubbish and 150 discarded oxygen bottles from Everest. So he's a good guy.
Okay.
Also, I'm going to put a picture of him up, but he looks kind of like you'd expect a 90s climber to look.
Naughty.
Yeah, like blonde, shaggy hair, tan, Oakleys.
Sure.
Could he be a surfer or a mountaineer? Probably both.
Heli skiing.
In May 1996, he was leading a guided team of 18 in climbing Everest, which included 2 guides, Neil Biedelman and Anatoly Bukriv.
Nailed it.
And 8 clients, assisted by 8 Sherpas, led by Lobsang Yangbu Sherpa. On the 6th of May, the team left base camp for their summit climb. At Camp 2, which is at 6,400 metres, Fisher learned that one of his friends was ill and was unable to make it out of Camp 1. So Fisher descends from Camp 2 back to Camp 1, meets up with his friend and takes him back down to base camp. He then leaves base camp again, goes and rejoins his team at Camp 2, and then he has a really slow ascent to Camp 3. On the 10th of May, Fisher and his team reached the summit after 3:45 p.m, which is much later. So there's a safe turnaround time on Everest at about 2 p.m.
Okay.
If you're later than that, you're going to be stuck in the death zone in the dark.
Ugh.
So they reached the summit at 3:45. So due to the unusually high number of climbers who tried to make it to the summit on the same day, they made it late. They got in the queue late. He's exhausted from the ascent and becoming increasingly ill, possibly suffering from high altitude pulmonary embolism, high altitude cerebral embolism, or a combination of both.
Okay.
Do you know what those are?
No.
A pulmonary embolism, blood clot in your lungs.
Okay.
Cerebral embolism, blood clot in your brain.
Lovely.
This is not his first time up Everest. He's been up and down before. He's a climber, but it's his first time having any of these medical issues, which is what I was saying earlier. Like, just because you've been up loads doesn't mean you're not going to suddenly have a problem. So his climbing partner, Lopsang Jangbu Sherpa, descends part of the way with him when the blizzard started. So there's this is one of the problems with Everest. Terrible weather. So near the southeast ridge balcony, Fisher asks Lopsang to descend without him and send back Bukriv for help. After the storm subsided on the 11th of May, 2 Sherpas reached Fisher and the leader of a Taiwanese expedition who was also stuck. Fisher was unresponsive and the Sherpas placed an oxygen mask over his face before carrying the leader of the Taiwanese expedition back down to Camp 4. After rescuing other people, Bukriv finally reached Fisher, who was already dead. He described Fisher as having exhibited paradoxical undressing, which is commonly associated with hypothermia. He says, his oxygen mask is around his face, but bottle is empty. He's not wearing mittens, hands completely bare. Down suit is unzipped, pulled off his shoulder. One arm is outside his clothing. There is nothing I can do. Scott is dead. Bukriv shrouded Fisher's upper torso and moved his body off the main climbing route, and his body remains on the mountain. But he has been pushed off the main route, so I don't think he's seen. Sadly, Lopsang Jangbu Sherpa died in an avalanche in autumn of 1996, also on an expedition to Everest, and Bukriv died in December 1997 in an avalanche on an expedition to Annapurna.
So they're all mad, basically.
Well, they're all mad because if you've done something like as traumatic as finding your friend dead on the side of the mountain, but the next year you're like, up I'm going. It is like this obsessive madness.
It's cool. I suppose everybody's got to die sometime. One life, no fear.
Oh, you've gone full 90s.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you a job in a surf shop.
It's like an advert for animal clothing.
It is. So also in 1996, we have a person who has the dubious accolade of being possibly the most famous body on Everest. Do you know who the most famous body on Everest is? The most famous body on Everest is that of Green Boots, who is believed to be Swang Paljaw, and he is encountered by most people who summit Everest.
Green Boots.
Green Boots. In fact, his position, lying across the path at the mouth of a cave, is one where a lot of climbers pause to rest before reaching the summit, and it's really hard to ignore because you're just sitting there with this body.
With Green Boots?
Yeah. So, Paljaw was a member of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, which is an armed force specialising in high-altitude landscapes. He was strong, focused and enthusiastic, and so he was selected to join an elite group of climbers who would undertake to become the first Indians ever to summit Everest from the north side. However, the group leader, Harbhajan Singh, admitted that from the get-go the attempt was just marred with mistake after mistake, and the group of 3 young men selected to summit first, which included Paljaw, just failed to listen or follow instructions from quite early on. The men were too late to do the ascent. You need to start returning to camp at a certain time, as we said, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, before dark, and when their guide signalled for them to return, they either didn't see him or ignored him and continued. Singh has no choice but to descend back to camp without them. He's behind them, they've gone ahead of him. And he says that he suspects the men had succumbed to summit fever. And I think he just has this really terrible survivor guilt, because he was like, if I'd gone up with them, I would have died. But I don't know, I think it must be really horrible. So the three men radio Singh and they tell him that they're close to the summit, and he says, please come back. The weather looks really bad. It's getting dark. It's not good. You need to come back. And they say no. They say they're really close to the summit. They beg him basically to go, and they push on. And then at 35 minutes past 5, he gets a radio from them and they say that they're at the top.
Good for them.
They've summited, and he's so relieved, and they've done the record for their country, and he's really proud. And he's kind of hopeful that the worst is over. As you would be, as I said, like, I don't know why you think that coming down is going to be so much easier. Soon after, though, the infamous 1996 blizzard arrives, cloaking the mountain in a fury of snow and wind. By 8 p.m, when his men had not returned, Singh found a team of Japanese climbers who were about to attempt the summit. So basically, to get up the summit, you have to get up at like 2 in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
So he finds a Sherpa who speaks some Japanese, and he tries to speak to them through this Sherpa. He impressed upon them the importance of the situation and says, in his presence, the Japanese leader radioed his team at Camp 6 to explain the situation, and then told Singh that the Japanese climbers would do all they could to help the stranded Indians if they encountered them on their way to the summit. According to Singh, he was told that the Sherpa translator ensured us on his behalf that the Japanese would treat this crisis as their own. What do you think's going to happen?
I don't know. I mean, why isn't Singh going up?
Because it's too dangerous to go up. He's got people he needs to be in the camp with. It's those three that were chosen to summit.
Okay. But he's saying to these Japanese guys, if you're going to go
because they're going
up
up anyway. Okay. So by morning, the storm's died down and the Japanese are able to set out for the summit. At 9 o'clock, the leader of their team informed Singh that his two climbers had encountered Morup, who's one of the three men, who's frostbitten and lying in the snow. They'd helped him clip on to the next fixed line, but then continued on their push to the summit, and Singh and his team are distraught. This is a huge controversial thing, which we're going to get into in a minute. 2 hours later, under clear and serene sky, the two Japanese climbers and their three Sherpas passed Smanla and Paljor, but again did not stop to give them any help. Why did they not give even a drop of water to our dying men? What about mountaineering ethics? Singh writes. The Japanese had left us with little hope. The Japanese team, however, later contested this version of events and gave a press conference. The baseless accusations, they said, made against them entirely hinged on a flawed one-sided information. They issued an official report stating that the two Japanese climbers had not been informed that the Indian climbers were in any sort of trouble, and although they did encounter several climbers on their way up, one of them said, we did not see anybody who seemed to be in trouble or dying. The report they issued also emphasised that above 8,000 metres, it is common sense that every climber should be held accountable for their actions, even on the brink of death. And this situation caused a huge furore in the climbing community, as Serap Jangru Sherpa, the first person to climb all 8 of Nepal's 8,000 metre peaks and the first person to summit K2 twice in 1 year, says, saving one life is more important than summiting Everest 100 times. We can always go back and summit, but a lost life never comes back. One of the Japanese climbers says he was unaware of the direness of the situation, but also tells of the difficulties of just existing at that altitude. Whatever happened, the three men never returned, and Paljor lay with his red fleece pulled up around his face, hiding it from view, and his arms wrapped firmly around his torso to ward off the biting wind and cold. His legs stretched into the path, forcing passers-by to gingerly step over his neon green climbing boots. In 2014, his body was moved to a less conspicuous location. It's believed that the Chinese did it, but no one's quite sure.
So you don't get green boots anymore?
You don't have green boots anymore.
That's sad.
I think his family are probably very happy about it.
No.
Being green
It's a
boots.
sad story.
Oh, it is. It's awful.
I'm also pleased that Green Boots has got some dignity.
So
I didn't mean.
It's sad.
Oh, sad.
It's sad that you don't get to see him.
Where's the landmark gone? No, I think that's.
Well, I just think it's
good.
so horrible. Well, we'll talk about it in a minute. In May 1996, again in this blizzard, Beck Weathers is one of 8 climbers being guided on Mount Everest by Rob Hall of Adventure Consultant. Rob Hall is a big deal New Zealander climber. Weathers had recently had laser eye surgery, which he was supposedly fully recovered from, but soon realised that he was blinded by the effect of high altitude and overexposure to ultraviolet radiation. Both of these effects obviously hadn't been tested before, because when he had it done, the laser eye surgery was really new, so nobody knew what effect it would have at high altitude. But basically, if it was daylight, he was blind. On the 10th of May, the day of the summit assault, Hall, having been told that Weathers could not see, said he should descend to Camp 4 immediately. Weathers, however, thought his vision might improve when the sun came out, so Hall said he had to wait until Hall came back down to ascend with him. However, Hall had to help. They summit. Hall and the others summit, but Hall has to help another member of the group who suffers from exhaustion, and he vows to stay with him. So on the way down, client Doug Hansen was found just above the Hillary Step, named after Hillary. Mm-hmm. And a Sherpa ordered him to descend. Hansen refuses. When Hall arrives on the scene, he sends the Sherpas down to assist the other clients and stated that he would remain to help Hansen, who had run out of supplementary oxygen. At 5 o'clock, the blizzard struck the southward face of Everest, diminishing visibility and obliterating the trail back to Camp 4. Shortly afterward, Hall radioed for help, saying that Hansen had fallen unconscious but was still alive. Adventure Consultant's guide Andy Harris began climbing to the Hillary Step at 5:30 p.m. with water and supplementary oxygen. On the 11th of May at 4:43, close to 12 hours after the blizzard had started, Hall radioed down and said that he was on the south summit. He reported that Harris had reached the 2 men, but that Hansen had died sometime during the night and that Harris was missing as well. Hall was not breathing bottled oxygen because his regulator was too choked with ice. By 9 o'clock, Hall had fixed his oxygen mask, but indicated that his frostbitten hands and feet were making it difficult to traverse the fixed ropes. Later in the afternoon, he radioed to base camp asking them to call his wife on the satellite phone, and during this last communication he reassured her that he was reasonably comfortable and told her, "Sleep well, my sweetheart, please don't worry too much," and he died shortly afterwards. His body was found on May the 23rd by mountaineers from the IMAX expedition and still remains just below the south summit.
Okay.
So, meanwhile, further down the little hill they're climbing, Weathers is waiting for Hall to return. Now, a number of people have passed him on the way down and offered him a spot with them to descend, but he refused because he'd promised Hall that he would wait.
God.
After almost 10 hours, he realises that something awful must have gone wrong and that people had been passing him offering to help were thinning out, obviously, because of the time that's passing. Eventually, he begins to descend with one of the guides from his team, Michael Groom, who comes back down, but the blizzard then strikes. Weathers and 10 other climbers become disorientated in the storm, and the team huddle together but almost walk off the side of the mountain when they're trying to look for their tents. Weathers has somehow lost a glove in the process, and remember, he can't really see, and he begins to feel the effects of high altitude and freezing temperatures. By the time there's a break in the storm several hours later, Weathers has been so weakened that he and 4 other men and women are left at the camp so the others could summon help. Holding his arms above his head with his right hand frozen beyond recognition, Weathers begins screaming and shouting, saying he has it all figured out, and then suddenly a gust of wind blows him backwards into the snow. Now, Bulkriev, remember, from the Fisher expedition, who's a guide by the expedition led by Scott Fisher, came to the rescue but deemed Weathers too far gone to save. So he took the two of the four, because there's Weathers and three other people.
So he just leaves Weathers like ranting and raving in there.
But he's not ranting and raving anymore. He's just lying in the snow.
Jesus.
So you've got to choose who's the most far gone. The next day, after the storm had passed, another client on Hall's team, Stuart Hutchinson. Now, they say a Canadian doctor, so I don't know if Stuart Hutchinson is the Canadian doctor. Anyway, and two Sherpas arrived to check on the status of Weathers, and fellow climber Yusuku Namba. After peeling a sheet of ice off her body, they decide that Namba is just beyond saving. She's too far gone. And when he sees Weathers, he's inclined to say the same. And so, believing Weathers and Namba are both so near death, they wouldn't make it off the mountain alive, they tried to make them as comfortable as possible and then return to Camp 4. So Weathers spends the night in an open bivouac in a blizzard, with his face and hands exposed, encrusted with ice. His jacket's open to the waist, because remember, when you get hypothermia, quite often you feel boiling hot, so you try and take your clothes off. And he's in a hypothermic coma. Several of his limbs were stiff with cold, and then by some miracle, Weathers awakes from his hypothermic coma at around 4 p.m. And he says, "I was so far gone in terms of not being connected to where I was. There was this nice, warm, comfortable sense of being in my bed. It was really not unpleasant." He soon realised, though, that he was not, and he began to check his limbs. His right arm, he said, sounded like wood when he banged it against the ground. And the realisation dawns where he is and what's happened. And he gets this wave of adrenaline that courses through his body, and somehow he gets up and starts to walk down to Camp 4.
Wow.
Bearing in mind there are people that have been found conscious that haven't been able to get off the mountain because they physically can't do it. This guy just gets up, walks down to the camp. His fellow climbers said that his frozen hand and nose looked and felt as if it was made of porcelain. Weathers was later helped to walk on his two frozen feet to a lower camp, and where he was the subject of one of the highest altitude medical evacuations ever performed by helicopter. And following his helicopter evacuation, his right arm was amputated halfway between the elbow and wrist. His four fingers and his thumb on his left hand were amputated, as well as parts of both feet. His nose is amputated and reconstructed with tissue from his ear and his forehead, and they grew his new nose on his forehead.
Do you have photos for the website?
Yeah, but that's just 1996. So that blizzard...
Dude.
I know, isn't it brutal? That blizzard...
Why are they so stupid?
I just think the blizzard was so bad that it
Took out all of those people?
Took out all of those people, but took out Scott Fisher, Rob Hall, probably Harris, I think. We don't know what happened to Harris. Like, those expert climbers who get paid thousands of pounds to guide people up Everest, and it was so bad that...
It all got done.
Yeah. Now we're moving on to 1998.
Oh, God.
Another climber who remains on the mountain and has been given a name, so we've got green boots, is Frances Arsentiv, who's also known as Sleeping Beauty.
Oh.
And Frances and her husband Sergei wanted to reach the summit without supplemental oxygen. Why?
Okay.
And though they did succeed, they got into the trouble on their way down and were somehow separated. And Sergei reaches the camp believing that his wife's going to be there ahead of him, and she's not there. And so he waits for a few hours, and then he gets some oxygen and some medicine. So Sergei is a really experienced climber who gets called the snow leopard because he's just so sure-footed and knows what he's doing. So he gets oxygen and medicine and goes back in search of her. Details of what happened next are uncertain. What's believed to have happened is on the 23rd of May, Frances was found by an Uzbek team that were climbing the final few hundred metres to the summit. She appeared to be half conscious, affected by oxygen deprivation and frostbite. She's unable to move on her own, so they give her some oxygen and carry her down as far as they could until they depleted so much of their own oxygen that they became too tired to continue with the effort. So they gave up their summit to try and get her down.
Sure.
Francis was still alive when they left, and as the Uzbek climbers made their way down to the camp that evening, they encountered Sergei on his way back up to find her. This is the last time he's seen alive. It's believed that Sergei fell to his death looking for her. On the morning of the 24th of May, Briton Ian Woodall, South African Kathy O'Dowd and several more Uzbeks encountered Francis while on their way to the summit. She was found where she'd been left the evening before. Kathy actually wrote a book about it. I've read excerpts on it. It's really distressing because Kathy sees this body and she says it's really horrifying seeing all these bodies, but she realises that this one's alive, and so she makes them stop. They find Sergei's ice axe and rope nearby, but he's nowhere to be found. Both Woodall and O'Dowd called off their own summit attempts and tried to help Francis for more than an hour. I think it's Kathy who says it seems unfathomable to even think about going to the top. She was like, all my desire to get to the summit was zapped on seeing this lady in distress. So they sit with her for an hour. Kathy O'Dowd was the first to reach Francis, and she was traumatised when she had to leave her because Francis could only say three things. She would say, "Don't leave me, I'm an American, and why are you doing this to me?" And that was all she would say. And eventually they had to leave her because they were running out of their own oxygen and they were cold and they were fatigued and they were putting their own lives at risk. And so she dies as they found her lying on her side, still clipped onto her guide rope. So the mysterious disappearance of her husband was solved the following year when Jake Norton, a member of the 1999 Mallory and Irvin expedition, discovered Sergei's body lower down on the mountain face, apparently dead from a fall while attempting to rescue his wife. Woodall initiated and led an expedition in 2007 called the Dow of Everest with the purpose of returning to the mountain to bury the bodies of Francis Arsenyev and Green Boots, both of whom were plainly visible from the nearby climbing route. Francis' body was visible to climbers for 9 years, from her death on the 24th of May 1998 to the 23rd of May 2007 when Woodall's expedition found her. They did a brief ritual, wrapped her in an American flag and dropped her to a lower location on the face of the mountain so that her body's no longer in view. And Woodall married Kathy O'Dowd, and I think they were both just so traumatised by this that's why he wanted to go up and bury the bodies.
Okay.
So that because I think they felt like we feel like it just seems really barbaric to be walking past these perfectly formed dead bodies on your way to get to the top of a mountain. This one's pretty grim. 2006. 2006. We're on page 9 of 11. You're doing
God.
okay. Since 2006 until recently, those who sat with Green Boots near the summit often didn't realise that they were sharing their resting spot with one of the 12 people who died on the mountain in 2006. For years, in the back of the cave, huddled the body of climber David Sharp, who attempted to climb Mount Everest solo. He died in his attempt, and the story broke out in the mountaineering community and into popular media with a series of interviews, allegations and critiques causing international controversy. The question was whether climbers that season had left a man to die and whether he could have been saved. He was said to have attempted to summit Mount Everest by himself with no Sherpa or guide and fewer oxygen bottles than was considered normal. He went with a low-budget Nepal guide firm which only provides support at base camp, after which climbers go as a loose group. So you kind of go with a group, but you're on your own. The manager at Sharp's guide support said Sharp did not take enough oxygen for his summit attempt and did not have a Sherpa guide. So it's less clear as to who knew he was in trouble and if they knew, if they did know, if they were able to help him. But also, I think it's pretty fucking ridiculous to even let someone leave base camp with not enough oxygen.
Yeah.
So, double amputee climber Mark Ingalls said in an interview with the press on the 23rd of May 2006 that his climbing party and many others had passed Sharp on the 15th of May, sheltering under a rock overhang 450 metres below the summit, without attempting to rescue him. Ingalls said 40 people had passed by Sharp, but he might have been overlooked as climbers assumed Sharp was the corpse nicknamed Green Boots. But Ingalls was not aware that Turkish climbers had tried to help Sharp despite being in the process of helping an injured woman down the mountain. Though some people don't feel like Ingalls is necessarily a good commenter on this, he sometimes tweaks the details of it. Again, it's believed that it was just too expensive for people to save him.
Too expensive in terms of oxygen or what, time?
Yeah. Costs a lot of money to go up oxygen. So it's time, oxygen, you've got to have someone who's willing to risk their life to not achieve anything except for saving someone. And sadly, that's few and far between.
Some of them probably did think it was Green Boots.
Yeah, except he doesn't have green boots on, but...
Oh, okay. Then he's not Green Boots.
So, someone gives oxygen to David and tries to help him move for about an hour, but they couldn't get David to stand alone or even to rest on the across the shoulders. So they had to leave him. They say that even with 2 Sherpas, it was not going to be possible to get David down the tricky sections below. It's believed that Sharp got to the top and again is having trouble on the way back. So a Lebanese adventurer, Maxim Chaya, is descending from the summit and radios his base camp manager to say that he's found a frostbitten and unconscious climber in distress. He's unable to identify Sharp, who's obviously chosen to climb solo, so has no support, no one else to identify him. And the manager assumes that Sharp is part of a group that's already calculated that they must abandon him. So, because it's so rare for someone to climb completely on their own, he says his group have obviously decided that he's beyond help, so just leave him. As Sharp's condition deteriorates through the day, other descending climbers pass him, his opportunities for rescue diminish. His legs and feet curl from frostbite, preventing him from walking. The later descending climbers are lower on oxygen and lack the strength to offer aid. Time runs out for any Sherpas who return to rescue him. And David Sharp's body remained just below the summit on the Chinese side next to Green Boots, and they shared this space in a small rock cave for years. Sharp's body was removed from the cave in 2007, according to the BBC. He's basically huddled in the back of the cave.
I blame Joe Simpson for all of this.
Why?
Well, because he wrote that Touching the Void book, and he was like...
But when did Touching the Void come out?
92, something. I was a kid. And he was like, I had to cut the rope because otherwise I would have died. And it was really controversial. Like, people were like, would you cut the rope? You know, it was like a sort of dinner party conversation for...
I heard a podcast about that the other day.
And it's like, I'm with this Sherpa who says 100 summits is not worth one life or even trying to save a life. But obviously after Touching the Void, people were like, well, part of mountaineering is you've got to cut the rope.
Well, this huge...
You've got to survive, you know, you've got to do what you... And it's like, no, there's no other situation where you did... If you're soldiers and you're under fire... You don't go, leave that guy. You try and take them.
No man left behind.
Yeah.
But I listened to Karen and Georgia did Joe Simpson the other day. He cut the rope because he thought the other guy on the other end was dead.
Yeah, and he was going to die.
Yeah.
But
so
even in the book, he didn't really lie about it. He's like, I thought he was dead.
Yeah.
But it's like, yeah, but you just assumed he was dead, dude. And then he very much wasn't dead.
I mean, spoiler alert.
In the end, you saved his life.
Spoiler alert, they both survive.
Yeah. But this whole thing of like, oh shit, well, I'm going to have to just leave you. It's so creepy. It's like, why go to somewhere where your moral code is just going to get thrown out the window? I just don't get it, man. Why would you want to go up there? When, you know, I can understand the adventure and the excitement, but if it's just a crowded toilet where people are dying...
Well, we're going to get to that.
And you have to...
When you finish your ranting.
Thanks for having me.
So in 2010, a climber goes blind and ends up dying in the death zone. A. McSmith says, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the British climber Peter Kinloch was on the roof of the world in bright sunlight taking photographs of the Himalayas below, elated, cheery and bubbly. But Mount Everest is now his grave because only minutes later he suddenly went blind and had to be abandoned to die from the cold.
What?
I think that's almost the worst. Like, you're absolutely fine, but you're blind. And then they're just like, oh, sorry.
Why, like, if you went blind to just like, okay,
But you're going down slippery, icy slopes on...
So what, man?
Well, this is the thing. This is what is so difficult. So, I can remember when my sister, who you heard a couple of episodes ago telling us about the Morecambe Bay cockling disaster, told me about the bodies on Everest and that sometimes you'd have to pass someone dying and leave them there. And I couldn't believe that it was possible to just trudge past someone suffering in their last moments. I still think it must be horrendous. And as we saw with Cathy O'Dowd and that team, it was just a life-changing experience. And I'm not alone, Joseph. Sir Edmund Hillary said when interviewed by the New Zealand Herald after the death of David Sharp, if you have someone who is in great need and you're still strong and energetic, then you have a duty, really, to give all you can to get the man down. And getting to the summit becomes very secondary. I think the whole attitude towards climbing Everest has become rather horrifying. The people just want to get to the top. They don't give a damn for anybody else who may be in distress, and it doesn't impress me at all that they leave someone lying under a rock to die. And that is the story of the people you'll find on Everest.
I mean, it's horrible. The last one is the worst. So what if you've just gone blind? Like, if you're with other people, then they go, oh, dude, snow blindness. Hold on to my jacket. Try not to slip.
But also, if you're climbing down ropes, you'd think you'd be able to clip him onto a rope. And he could...
Bob Barrick. That's the worst.
Do you see why I'm so disturbed? I just think of, like, Hall. He's ascended, he's done it 100 times, and he just vows that he's not going to leave this dude who's ignored the Sherpa. And then he calls his wife.
Yeah. And his wife's probably like, oh, you knob.
Yeah, sure, that's what.
What are you doing?
I can imagine you phoning me and saying, babe, it's not looking good.
Don't worry.
I told you not to go.
I'm quite comfortable.
I think it's reassuring that Beck Weathers said he woke up and felt like he was in his nice warm bed at home.
Oh yeah, I always think that when people get eaten by sharks, they think they're swimming away.
But
traumatic.
I think that's
their body just goes whoop, and then I thought I was swimming away. It's all fine.
But is that an urban legend?
No.
What makes you say that?
Your body dumps loads of adrenaline into your head, and sometimes it makes you sit up like Weathers and walk on. Sometimes it makes you just go, okay, this is fine.
This is fine. But I think that's so amazing. I wonder what it is about him. I mean, because if you look at him before, very handsome, then he looks frighteningly frostbitten, and he's literally like, basically those bits of his body were dead.
So you're going to put pictures of that?
Yeah, but I just think so weird. I mean, Green Boots, the thing is, obviously I've looked at all of these pictures, Mallory looks horrifying. Green Boots, Sleeping Beauty, Hannah Nor Schmerz, they look like people.
Like mummified?
They don't look mummified.
Oh, okay, just people.
Well, you can't see the two women's faces. You can't see Green Boots' face either. But...
Dude, it sounds rubbish up there.
It sounds so horrible.
Yeah.
And I think it's so interesting that Hillary... And obviously, Hillary's got this smugness of being the first man with Sherpa Tenzing to ascend. So he's all like, I did it first. And everyone else is just trying to copy me, which I totally get. Yeah. But also, it's like, it's just become this cue to get up somewhere just to say that you've done it, and it doesn't fucking matter that you walk past people who are dying, and there's shit everywhere.
I wonder if they take selfies.
Yeah. Of course they take selfies now.
Yeah.
But also, I think I'd feel so unsettled if I was at the top of Everest and I'm taking my selfie and I'm uploading my Instagram stories. You probably don't have any Wi-Fi up there, right?
No, I don't think there's any Wi-Fi.
Okay. Another reason not to go.
Jesus.
But imagine you're up there, you're taking your selfie, and really, probability dictates you
could die.
you're more likely to die on the way down.
Yeah.
And it is that horrible thing, and I love that expedition that went to roll Sleeping Beauty off the side of the mountain. And actually, there was a bit of controversy about that because they didn't okay it with her son. Weirdly, you'd think that you'd say to her son, we thought we'd go up and give her a proper burial. Is that all right with you? He just found out in the papers. But he was very magnanimous about it and said, I'm affected by the death of my mother, but I wasn't there. And they were with her, and that's affected them forever. And therefore, they have just as much right as I have to
roll her down the mountain.
Yeah. It's just grim.
Do you remember in Modern Family when Phil Dunphy gets a chance to go to space, and then he has to admit to his wife, "I'm terrified of going to space. I don't want to go."
Yeah.
I would go to space.
Would you?
Yeah, and I would go in a submarine.
No.
And I love boats and sailing. I would go sailing again. But if somebody said, "Do you want to go and do like the apple pie run, just the base camp?" I'd be like,
No.
Yeah, I'd like to look at the mountain from like a nice restaurant.
Yeah, I don't have that thing, and people and I know that some people would be like, "Oh, you're chicken." Yes, I don't want to do it. Don't want to bungee jump.
Yeah.
I was never one for what's it called when you're a teenager, your friends make you do stuff.
Yeah, I really admire people like I know some people who are climbers like Tom and John. Remember John, the Sheffield engineer dude?
Nothing on God's earth makes me
Climbing,
want to climb.
caving, all that stuff.
You know how sometimes when you pull yourself up on something and you break a nail? Have you never done that? I don't have long nails. Don't make it sound like I'm here with my acrylics on. But it really hurts when your fingers ping off a grip.
Yeah.
I can't imagine doing that by choice over and over and over again. I like a nice dog walk.
Yeah, I can't imagine being able to lift my own weight as well.
Well, there is that.
Unfortunately. In fact, I tried to do it in the children's playground.
Didn't work.
It was humiliating.
So, you will be able to find some pictures on our social media. We're at the Monday Night Review on Instagram, TikTok and Facebook. You can join the Patreon, which is www.patreon.com/The Monday Night Review, where you can listen to everything ad-free. If you join the top tier, you get mini-sodes, you get little extra stories every week. Thanks to Joe for being my moral support throughout this horrendous episode, and I'm really excited to...
It was an honour to be on the Monday Night Review.
Do you feel vaguely traumatised?
Yeah, I can see why you didn't like that one.
No, when we went
It's just that it's not the individual murderers, it's not the ghosts, it's the normal arseholes with lots of money, and they're all just got collective psychosis.
Yeah.
Screw those guys.
It's just such a weird thing. I'm really excited to leave Everest behind, hopefully forever. I'm leaving Everest. Also, do you know what? I know it sounds really silly, but just as I was disabused about the Rainbow Valley, which is not full of unicorns, I also don't want to go somewhere where there's a lot of human shit. I just don't. It's bad enough having a septic tank.
You've been to the Big Chill.
Big Chill was horrendous. How many days was that? Felt like 3 years. It's like 2 days. 2 days, was it? It was awful. That was enough. I've been to a festival. Been to a few festivals. That one, the
That
was
special on the fecal front.
It was. And I'm like, so what? I mean, I get the wanting to summit. Look, we're still going. I get the wanting to summit, but I don't get the, like, you've got to trek for 44 days through human feces to get there. Or not. Well done, Hillary. Well done, everyone who's done it. Why do people have to ruin everything? The end. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.